Picture this, a tent on the edge of nowhere, canvas walls snapping in the wind like the wings of dying birds. Outside, the Danube groans under sheets of black ice. Inside, a single oil lamp throws shadows across a face that hasn't known rest in weeks. The man's hands shake, not from cold, though the cold is brutal, seeping through wool and fur and flesh until it settles in the marrow. No. His hands shake because the medicine is wearing off. He can feel it leaving his blood like a tide pulling back from shore, exposing all the jagged things beneath. The pain in his chest, the fire in his joints, the screaming in his skull that never quite stops anymore. He reaches for the vial. Brown glass, small enough to hide in a fist. The liquid inside smells of honey and something darker, bitter, earthy, wrong. He knows what it is. He knows what it's doing to him. He drinks it anyway. The warmth spreads, slow at first, then faster, rushing through his veins like whispered forgiveness. The shaking stops, the pain retreats, and for a few precious hours he can think again. He can write. He pulls the parchment closer. The ink is nearly frozen. He breathes on it, watches his breath turn to fog, dips his stylus and begins. At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work, as a human being. Outside, 10,000 men are dying. Plague has hollowed out 3 legions. The Germanic tribes smell weakness like wolves smell blood. Supply lines have collapsed. Desertion is epidemic, and here, in this frozen tent, the most powerful man in the world is writing notes to himself about how to be a decent person. He pauses, reads what he's written, almost laughs. Work. As a human being. What does that even mean anymore? He's ordered villages burned, watched prisoners executed by the hundreds, signed death warrants for men whose only crime was being born on the wrong side of a river. He tells himself it's necessary. He tells himself the empire requires it. But the philosophy that once gave him comfort now reads like a joke, told by someone who never stood knee-deep in frozen mud, while boys screamed for their mothers. The tent flap opens, a blast of Arctic air. An officer's voice, tight with barely controlled panic. Caesar, the Marcomanni have crossed again. 3rd breach this month. He doesn't look up, he already knows. He's known for hours. Felt it in his bones the way old soldiers feel coming storms. Casualties? 2 cohorts, maybe 3. The scouts aren't sure. The bodies are scattered. Scattered. Such a clean word for such a dirty truth. He's seen scattered. He's walked through scattered, limbs separated from torsos, heads mounted on stakes, intestines steaming in the snow like offerings to gods who stopped listening centuries ago. Reinforce the eastern position, double the watch, and send for Galen. The officer hesitates. Caesar, Galen is occupied. The field hospital. I don't care, send for him. The flap closes. Silence returns, and the man who rules the world turns back to his parchment, his lamp, his vial of borrowed peace. His name is Marcus Aurelius. History will call him the last of the 5 good emperors. Philosophy students will read his meditations for 2,000 years, finding in them a model of Stoic virtue, rational governance and serene wisdom. They will imagine a marble statue, calm, noble, untouched by the chaos he navigated. They will imagine wrong. The real Marcus Aurelius died in this tent. Not all at once. That would have been a mercy. No, he died in pieces over years, one compromise at a time. The plague took his health, the wars took his principles, the medicine took everything else, and his son, the heir he raised, trained and loved, would take the empire itself and drive it toward an abyss from which it would never fully recover. Historians still debate whether Marcus knew, whether he saw what Commodus was becoming, whether he chose denial over despair or simply ran out of strength to care. But that question misses the larger tragedy, because the real question isn't whether Marcus failed as a father. The real question is, how does a man spend his entire life pursuing wisdom, virtue, and self-mastery, and still lose everything that matters? How does a philosopher become a butcher? And how does an empire remember him as a saint? The boy who would become emperor was afraid of horses. This seems like a small thing, trivial, But in Rome, where power was measured in cavalry charges and military triumphs, it was a confession of fundamental unsuitability. Boys of noble birth learned to ride before they learned to read. They practiced with wooden swords, dreaming of the day they'd carry real ones into real battles. Marcus Annius Verus practiced rhetoric instead. He was born in 121 AD, into a family wealthy enough to matter but not powerful enough to threaten. His father died when Marcus was 3, a fever, quick and merciless, the kind of death that visited Roman households like a seasonal tax. His mother remarried eventually, but Marcus was raised primarily by his grandfather, a stern old senator who believed in duty the way other men believed in gods. The household was comfortable but not luxurious. Tutors came and went. Marcus devoured them all. Philosophy, mathematics, law, Greek literature. He consumed knowledge the way other boys consumed wine and women. By 12, he was corresponding with scholars. By 14, he had adopted the rough-wool cloak of the Stoic philosophers, sleeping on hard ground to toughen himself, eating simple food, practicing the art of wanting nothing. His mother thought he was having a breakdown. "You're a Roman nobleman," she reportedly told him, "not a Greek beggar." But Marcus had found something in philosophy that his gilded childhood couldn't provide, a framework for understanding suffering. And in Rome, understanding suffering was a survival skill. The Emperor Hadrian noticed him first. Hadrian was brilliant, cruel and childless, a dangerous combination in a ruler. He needed an heir, and the usual candidates were either dead, disgraced, or demonstrably insane. Looking for alternatives, he spotted Marcus at a dinner party, watching the 17-year-old debate philosophy with men 3 times his age. What Hadrian saw was potential, what Marcus felt was dread. The adoption happened in stages. First, Hadrian adopted Antoninus Pius, a mild-mannered senator with no sons of his own. Then he required Antoninus to adopt Marcus, along with another boy named Lucius Verus. The message was clear: Marcus would be emperor. Not immediately, Antoninus would rule first, but eventually, inevitably, the throne would be his. Marcus tried to refuse. According to several accounts, he actually begged Antoninus to find someone else. The details vary. Some say he wept, others that he simply went silent for days. But the resistance was real. He knew what the purple meant. He'd watched Hadrian's reign, the paranoia, the executions, the slow corruption of every principle the man once held. "The throne doesn't make you powerful," Marcus wrote years later. "It makes you a prisoner in expensive chains." But refusal wasn't really an option. In Rome, rejecting imperial succession was roughly equivalent to suicide. It marked you as either a conspirator or a coward, and both categories tended to end up dead. So Marcus accepted. He married Antoninus' daughter, Faustina, a woman he would love with surprising genuineness for the rest of his life. He took on imperial duties. He waited. For 23 years, he waited. Antoninus Pius was a good emperor by Roman standards, which meant he killed relatively few people and maintained the borders without starting unnecessary wars. He also lived forever, or seemed to. Year after year, Marcus stood beside the throne, learning governance, mastering bureaucracy, growing older, and no closer to the power he didn't want. He filled the time with philosophy. The Stoic teachers came to him now, drawn by his reputation and his future authority. He studied with Apollonius of Chalcedon, who taught him emotional control, with Sextus of Chaeronea, who taught him patience, with Claudius Maximus, who taught him that virtue was not a destination but a practice, something you did daily in every decision. "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be," Maximus told him. "Be one." Historians still debate whether Marcus truly internalized these lessons, or whether he simply collected them like armor against what was coming. The Stoics taught that external circumstances were irrelevant. Only internal virtue mattered. But the Stoics had never commanded legions. They'd never signed execution orders. They'd never watched a plague hollow out their empire while barbarians gathered on every frontier. The philosophy was about to be tested. In March of 161 AD, Antoninus Pius finally died, peacefully, in his sleep. He was 74 years old and had ruled for 23 years without a single significant crisis. Marcus was 40. His hair was already greying, his joints already ached with the first whispers of the illness that would eventually kill him. And the empire he inherited was not the stable, prosperous machine Antoninus had enjoyed. It was a bomb with a lit fuse, built on conquest that demanded endless expansion and an economy that required endless slaves. He took the throne on March 7th. By March 8th, the Parthian Empire had invaded the eastern provinces. The philosopher's education was over. The butchers had just begun. The soldiers came home singing. This was normal after victory. The legions that had crushed Parthia in 166 AD marched westward through Syria, through Anatolia, through Greece, their standards high and their pockets heavy with plunder. They'd sacked Seleucia. They'd burned Ctesiphon. They'd done things to the Parthian royal palace that would make veterans weep with pride for generations. They also carried passengers they couldn't see. The first deaths happened in Smyrna. A few soldiers, nothing unusual. Men died on campaign all the time. But these deaths were different. The victims broke out in black pustules that wept fluid and stank of rot. Their fevers spiked so high that some tore off their own skin trying to cool down. They vomited blood. They bled from their eyes. And then the people who touched them started dying too. The army kept marching. What else could they do? Disbanding in foreign territory was suicide, so they pressed westward, through city after city, village after village, leaving a trail of corpses that local authorities were too overwhelmed to burn. By the time the legions reached Italy, the plague was a wildfire. Rome itself fell ill in the winter of 166 to 167 AD. The disease moved through the slums first, the insulae, those towering tenements where the poor lived stacked like cordwood, sharing water, sharing air, sharing death. Bodies piled in the streets faster than the undertakers could collect them. The smell of decay became the smell of the city. Then it climbed the Palatine Hill. Marcus received the reports in his study, surrounded by scrolls that suddenly seemed obscene. Philosophy, rhetoric, ethics. Meanwhile, his subjects were drowning in their own fluids a few miles away. The court physician, Galen, the most famous doctor in the empire, examined the first cases and went pale. "Caesar," he reportedly said, "I have never seen this before." Galen would later write extensively about the plague that bore his name. He described the pustules in clinical detail. He noted the fever's progression, the internal bleeding, the way victims' breath grew laboured as their lungs filled with fluid. He recommended treatments, bloodletting, dietary changes, theriac. Nothing worked. The disease killed indiscriminately. Slaves and senators, soldiers and scribes. It took Marcus's co-emperor Lucius Verus in 169 AD, the adopted brother he'd been forced to share power with, dead at 38, probably from the plague that the army he commanded had brought home. Historians still debate whether the Antonine plague was smallpox, measles, or something else entirely. The symptoms Galen described don't perfectly match any modern disease, but the mortality figures are clear. Between 5 and 10 million dead across the empire, perhaps a third of the population in some provinces. Cities that had stood for centuries became ghost towns overnight. The army was gutted. Legions that had numbered 5,000 men struggled to field 2,000. Recruitment became impressment. Gangs roaming the provinces, dragging farmers and craftsmen into service at spear point. The quality of Roman soldiers, once the pride of the ancient world, began its long decline. Marcus watched it all. The Stoic philosophy he'd studied for decades taught that death was natural. Loss is nothing else but change, he'd written, and change is nature's delight. But there's a difference between accepting death in the abstract and smelling it in your own palace. Between writing about impermanence and watching your servants hauled away to plague pits. He kept working. What else could he do? The empire required administration, tax records, military appointments, judicial decisions. The machinery of Rome ground forward regardless of how many bodies it crushed. But the burden was changing him. The sleeplessness started here. The chest pains that would eventually kill him first appeared during the plague years, and his physician, the same Galen who couldn't stop the dying, offered him a remedy: theriac. It was Rome's universal medicine, a compound of dozens of ingredients, herbs, minerals, honey, and, crucially, opium. Lots of opium. The recipe had been refined over centuries, passed down from king to king, physician to physician. It was supposed to cure everything from snake bites to depression. What it actually did was make the pain stop. Marcus took his first dose in 167 AD for stomach troubles that Galen attributed to stress. The relief was immediate. Warmth, calm. The screaming in his head, the constant awareness of disaster pressing from every direction, went quiet. He took a second dose that night. By 170 AD, he was taking it daily. The empire was crumbling, the frontiers were on fire, and the philosopher-emperor had found a way to stop feeling any of it. The price would come later. It always does. The first time Marcus missed the dose, he thought he was dying. It started with sweat, cold, clammy, soaking through his tunic before dawn, then the shaking, then the cramps that twisted his intestines into knots. His vision swam. His heart raced like a chariot horse whipped past endurance, and the pain, all the pain he'd been hiding from, came back at once, magnified, screaming through every nerve. Galen found him on the floor of his private chambers, curled into himself, gasping. "Caesar! The medicine!" Marcus could barely form the words. "I need the medicine!" Galen hesitated. Just for a moment. A flicker of something crossed his face. Recognition, perhaps. Concern. The kind of look a physician gives when he realizes he's made a terrible mistake. Then he administered the theriac. The relief was instant. Marcus's body unclenched. His breathing steadied. The world stopped spinning and settled back into place. He lay there on the marble floor, staring at the painted ceiling, feeling the opium wrap around his consciousness like a warm blanket. "You must not miss your doses," Galen said carefully. "Your constitution has become accustomed." Accustomed. Such a gentle word for such a brutal truth. Marcus understood. He was a philosopher, after all. He knew the Stoic teachings on addiction, on weakness, on the dangers of depending on external things for internal peace. He knew exactly what was happening to him. He just couldn't stop. The theriac had become essential, not just for his physical ailments. The stomach problems that had first justified it had long since faded, but for his ability to function. Without it, the anxiety was paralyzing. The weight of the empire pressed down on him with physical force. Every decision felt impossible. Every report was a new catastrophe. Every dawn brought fresh horrors. With the medicine, he could bear it. Galen refined the dosage over the following months. He experimented with concentration, with timing, with additional ingredients meant to moderate the opium's effects. He was threading a needle, keeping the emperor functional without letting him dissolve into permanent stupor. According to Galen's own writings, Marcus eventually required a dose strong enough to kill a normal man. The effects were visible to those who knew where to look. The emperor's pupils, once sharp and attentive, grew permanently dilated. His speech sometimes slurred, especially in the evenings. His movements became slower, more deliberate, not the calm of a Stoic master, but the careful precision of someone fighting through fog. His mood shifted too. The young Marcus had been consistent, emotionally controlled, rarely angry and never cruel. The medicated Marcus developed new qualities: irritability, paranoia, a tendency toward harsh judgments that contradicted his philosophical principles. "Receive without conceit, release without struggle," he'd written in his early meditations. But releasing the theriac was beyond him now, and conceit, the belief that he was still in control, still the philosopher he'd trained to be, was the lie that kept him going. Historians still debate whether Marcus understood the full extent of his addiction. Galen's writings are carefully euphemistic. He refers to therapeutic habituation and necessary support for imperial duties. But between the lines, a darker picture emerges. Marcus was dependent, chemically, psychologically, completely. and the dependency was changing his decisions. Consider the case of Avidius Cassius. In 175 AD, this Syrian general received false reports that Marcus had died and declared himself emperor. When the reports proved wrong, Cassius was in an impossible position: rebel against a living emperor, or surrender and face certain execution. The old Marcus would have offered terms: clemency, understanding that Cassius had acted on bad information. The medicated Marcus declared him a traitor and demanded his head. Cassius was killed by his own officers before Marcus could reach him. But the emperor's reaction revealed something troubling. He was disappointed, not that Cassius had died, but that he hadn't died slowly enough, that Marcus hadn't been able to watch. "I wanted to forgive him," Marcus wrote afterward, "but I also wanted him to suffer first." This was not Stoic philosophy. This was opium talking. The drug that numbed his pain also numbed his mercy, replacing considered judgment with raw impulse. The frontier commanders noticed. The senators noticed. His own family noticed. The emperor, who had once deliberated for hours over minor decisions, now snapped out orders that contradicted themselves. He alternated between excessive leniency and startling brutality, depending on when he'd last taken his dose. But no one could say anything. You didn't tell the emperor he was an addict. You didn't suggest that Rome's ruler was making decisions through a pharmaceutical haze. You just watched, and waited, and prayed that the medicine didn't run out before the barbarians did. The Danube froze solid in the winter of 167 AD. For centuries that river had been Rome's shield, too wide to bridge easily, too deep to ford, too fast to cross in force without boats that the barbarians didn't have. The legions stationed along its banks could watch the Germanic tribes gather on the opposite shore and feel relatively safe. Then the ice came. 12 tribes crossed that winter, not raiding parties, entire peoples: the Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Iazyges, the Vandals, men, women, children, livestock, everything they owned loaded onto sledges and dragged across the frozen water while Roman sentries stared in disbelief. They weren't coming to steal. They were coming to stay. The frontier system collapsed within weeks. Forts that had stood for generations were overrun. Garrison towns burned. The civilian settlements behind the military line, the canabae where soldiers' families lived, became slaughterhouses. Marcus received the reports in Rome, each messenger worse than the last. The Marcomanni had reached Aquileia. The Quadi were besieging Carnuntum. The Iazyges had penetrated so deep into imperial territory that they were within striking distance of Italy itself. Italy. No foreign enemy had threatened the Italian peninsula in over 2 centuries. The psychological shock was almost worse than the military one. Rome's whole identity was built on being untouchable, on projecting power outward, crushing threats before they could approach. Now barbarians were within a week's march of the capital. The Senate panicked. The markets collapsed. Refugees flooded south, bringing with them plague and stories of atrocities that grew more horrifying with each telling. Babies dashed against rocks, women taken as slaves, the lucky ones killed instead, old men impaled and left to die over days, their screams serving as warnings to anyone who might resist. Marcus had to respond, but with what? The plague had gutted his legions. The treasury was exhausted from the Parthian War. The political system, designed for expansion, not defense, had no mechanism for rapid emergency response. He spent weeks in meetings, listening to advisors contradict each other, propose impossible solutions, blame each other for failures no one could have predicted. Finally, he did something no emperor had done in living memory. He sold the furniture, not metaphorically, literally. Marcus ordered the imperial household goods auctioned in the forum: statues, jewellery, silk robes, golden cups, his wife's gems, his own ceremonial armour. Everything that could be sold was sold, and the proceeds went directly to raising new legions. The symbolism was intentional. The emperor was sacrificing his own luxury for Rome's defence. But the reality was starker. The empire was so broke that its ruler had to pawn his possessions to field an army. The new legions were a problem of their own. With not enough Roman citizens to fill the ranks, Marcus recruited from populations that had never served before. gladiators, slaves, Germanic tribesmen who'd been captured in previous campaigns and were now being armed to fight their own kinsmen. Bandits offered amnesty in exchange for service. The professional army that had conquered the known world was becoming a desperate collection of amateurs and outcasts. Marcus led them north personally in 168 AD. He had no choice. The frontier required imperial presence. Only the emperor's authority could coordinate the multiple legions, supply lines, and provincial governments needed for a response at this scale. It was the first time he'd left Rome for extended military duty. He would barely see the city again for the rest of his life. The journey north revealed the extent of the catastrophe. Burned villages, unburied dead. Survivors who stared at the imperial column with eyes that had stopped hoping. The smell of smoke hung over everything. Not fresh fire, but old burning. The residue of destruction that had moved on but left its mark. Historians still debate whether the Marcomannic Wars were survivable. Some argue that Rome's ultimate victory proved the empire's resilience. Others note that the wars triggered a decline from which the empire never fully recovered. The beginning of the long slide toward collapse 3 centuries later. But standing there on the frozen riverbank, watching Germanic scouts on the far shore watch him back, Marcus wasn't thinking about centuries. He was thinking about tomorrow, about the 10,000 men behind him who might not survive the week, about the medicine wearing off and the pain returning and the decisions he'd have to make before he could take another dose. The philosopher who never wanted power was about to become a general, and generals, he was learning, couldn't afford philosophy. Before we see how this ends, understand one thing. Marcus Aurelius did not become a monster overnight. He became one decision at a time, each step smaller than the last, each justification a little easier than the one before. The first massacre was almost an accident. A Marcomanni settlement had been identified near Carnuntum, a temporary camp where warriors were storing food and weapons, while their families huddled in makeshift shelters. Standard military doctrine called for encirclement and assault, killing the fighters and capturing the rest for slavery. But Marcus's scouts reported that the men had left to raid further south. Only women, children, and elderly remained. The traditional Roman response would have been to bypass the camp. Non-combatants weren't worth the effort. They'd flee, or starve, or become someone else's problem. Marcus had studied enough military history to know this. He ordered the camp destroyed anyway. The justification was strategic. The families would provide food and shelter when the warriors returned. Eliminating them eliminated that support. It was simple logistics, the kind of calculation that appeared in military manuals written by men who'd never smelled burning flesh. The execution was straightforward. The legionaries were professionals. They surrounded the camp before dawn, moved in at first light and killed everything that moved. The elderly were dispatched quickly. Roman swords were designed for efficient killing, and old bones offered little resistance. The women took longer. Some fought, some ran, some tried to hide their children. The children took longest of all. Marcus wasn't there. Emperors didn't personally supervise camp clearances, but he received the report that evening, written in the bland administrative language of military bureaucracy. Settlement neutralized. Estimated enemy personnel eliminated 342. Roman casualties, 3 wounded, none fatal. 342. He read the number, drank his theriac, went to sleep. The second massacre was deliberate. Intelligence reports suggested that Quadi villages in a particular valley were feeding and sheltering raiding parties. Marcus didn't wait for scouts to confirm which villages or how many were actually involved. He ordered the entire valley burned. 12 villages. Perhaps 4,000 people. The reports were unclear, and Marcus didn't ask for clarification. The soldiers did their work efficiently. By now, they were experienced. They knew how to seal escape routes, how to use fire to drive people into killing zones, how to deal with survivors quickly enough to move on before nightfall. Some of the legionaries had been doing this for months. They'd stopped seeing faces. They'd started seeing targets. In war, everything is simple, Marcus wrote that winter. But simple things are difficult. He'd stolen the line from the Stoics. They'd meant it philosophically. He was using it as an excuse. The massacres multiplied through 170 and 171 AD. Reprisal raids became standard practice. The barbarians killed Roman civilians. The Romans killed barbarian civilians. The barbarians burned Roman settlements. The Romans burned everything they found. The logic was circular, self-perpetuating, escalating with each rotation. Marcus told himself he was restoring order, establishing deterrence, teaching the tribes that Rome would match any atrocity with worse. The Stoics taught that justice sometimes required harsh measures. Hadn't Cato defended mass executions during the conspiracy of Catiline? But the Stoics had also taught that cruelty corrupts the soul of the one who practices it. That vengeance was a passion to be controlled, not indulged. That the difference between justice and brutality was intention, and that intention could rot without the intender noticing. Historians still debate whether Marcus's strategy was militarily effective. Some argue that the terror campaigns broke the tribe's will to fight. Others point out that they created generations of enemies sworn to revenge, enemies who would return again and again for the next 3 centuries. What's not debatable is what happened to Marcus. His writings from this period are darker, more desperate. The serene philosophy of his early meditations gives way to something harder, bleaker, more defensive. He writes about duty constantly, as if repeating the word often enough could make it true. He writes about necessity, about acceptable costs, about the empire's survival justifying methods he would once have condemned. He stops writing about virtue entirely. The object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, he'd written as a young man, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane. Burning villages full of children had once been insane, now it was policy. And here's where it gets worse. The ground was frozen so hard that burial was impossible. The legionaries stopped trying after the first week. They stacked the dead instead, Roman and barbarian alike, in walls that served as windbreaks for the living. The bodies froze solid within hours, their faces locked in whatever expression death had caught. Some looked surprised, some looked terrified, most just looked empty. Marcus walked past these walls every morning on his way to the command tent. He made himself look. It was the least he owed them. The winter campaign of 172 to 173 AD was supposed to be decisive. Intelligence suggested that the Marcomanni had concentrated their forces in a river valley north of the Danube, a major camp where the tribe's chief, Balamar, was gathering warriors for a spring offensive. If the Romans could strike now, in the dead of winter, they might shatter the Marcomanni leadership before the offensive began. It was a good plan. It was also suicide. No Roman army had ever operated this deep in Germanic territory during winter. The logistical challenges were staggering. Supply wagons bogged down in snow. Mules died of cold faster than they could be replaced. The men's leather boots froze to their feet, and removing them sometimes removed skin as well. But Marcus pressed on. The medicine helped. It numbed not just pain but caution, replacing rational fear with pharmaceutical calm. His generals urged retreat. He overruled them. His physicians warned of frostbite casualties. He accepted them. Somewhere in his opium-smooth consciousness, he'd decided that winning this battle was worth whatever it cost. The Marcomanni camp appeared on the 7th day. It was larger than expected. Intelligence had said 5,000 warriors. Marcus's scouts now counted closer to 12,000, with more arriving daily. The Roman force was perhaps 15,000, exhausted, frozen, strung out along a narrow forest track. A wise commander would have withdrawn, waited for spring, gathered reinforcements, chosen better ground. Marcus ordered the attack at dawn. The charge was a nightmare. Snow-concealed holes that swallowed men whole. The frozen ground made footing treacherous. Soldiers slipped, fell, were trampled by the ranks behind them. The neat Roman formations dissolved into chaotic masses struggling just to move forward. Then the Marcomanni counterattacked. They came out of the trees, not in lines but in wedges, screaming war cries that echoed off the frozen hills. Their weapons were crude compared to Roman steel. Long spears, wooden shields reinforced with iron, axes that required both hands to swing. But they knew this ground. They'd grown up in this cold, and they were fighting for their families visible in the camp behind them. The first Roman cohort shattered on contact, literally shattered. The formation broke like glass, scattering men across the snowfield where they were hunted down individually. The second cohort held longer, maybe 20 minutes, before the pressure became unbearable and they too collapsed. Marcus watched from a ridge 300 yards back. His guards surrounded him, weapons drawn, but their eyes kept flickering to the escape route behind them. This wasn't battle, this was butchery. "Caesar!" His senior tribune's voice was carefully controlled. "We should consider withdrawal." The medicine was wearing off. Marcus could feel it. The familiar cold spreading through his veins, the pain returning like an old enemy who knew exactly where to strike. He needed a dose, needed the calm, needed to stop feeling what he was watching. "Reinforce the centre," he heard himself say. "Commit the reserves." "Caesar, the reserves are all that's preventing a complete rout." "I gave an order." The reserves went in. Fresh troops, as fresh as anyone could be after a week of frozen marching, thrown into the grinding chaos of the melee. They made a difference, briefly. The Roman line stabilised. The retreat slowed. For perhaps an hour it looked like determination might overcome disaster. Then Balamar committed his own reserves. The Marcomanni cavalry hit the Roman right flank like a hammer hitting ice. Horses the size of houses, their riders swinging long swords that could take off limbs with a single stroke. The flank didn't break. It ceased to exist. One moment it was there, the next it was a mass of screaming wounded and galloping death. Marcus finally ordered the retreat. What followed was worse than the battle. Retreating in snow, pursued by enemies who knew every trail and shortcut, abandoning wounded who couldn't keep up. The Marcomanni didn't take prisoners. They weren't interested in ransom. They wanted blood. Roman blood, in payment for burned villages and slaughtered families. Historians still debate whether the battle was a defeat or a draw. Roman sources claim heavy casualties on both sides. Germanic legends celebrate a great victory. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. A mutual bloodletting that accomplished nothing except proving that this war would not end easily. Marcus reached the Danube with perhaps 8,000 men. Almost half his force was dead, wounded, or simply gone, swallowed by the snow and the chaos and the relentless cold. He took his Theriac that night, double dose, and he started planning the next campaign. The summer of 174 AD came with fire. The Quadi had learned from the Marcomanni's winter campaign. They'd retreated north, deeper into their territory, drawing the Roman pursuit into terrain that favoured defence. And when Marcus's legions followed, as he knew they would, as he'd ordered them to, the Quadi trapped them in a valley ringed by hills. 12,000 Roman soldiers, no water, no shade. The Germanic tribes held every spring, every stream, every route of escape. All they had to do was wait, and wait they did. The first day was miserable. The second was desperate. By the third, men were drinking their own urine, mixing it with vinegar to mask the taste. Horses collapsed and were butchered for the moisture in their blood. The wounded died fastest. Their bodies couldn't compensate for the fluid loss. Marcus watched his army dying of thirst while enemy warriors lounged on the surrounding hillsides, occasionally descending to probe the Roman perimeter and withdraw before any real engagement. They were in no hurry. The sun was doing their killing for them. "Caesar!" His senior commander's lips were cracked, his voice a rasp. "We must attempt a breakout. Tonight, before we're too weak to fight." Marcus knew he was right. He also knew that a breakout would mean abandoning the wounded, the sick, the exhausted. Anyone who couldn't keep pace with a forced march through enemy territory. Thousands of men. His men. "Not yet," he said. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps the medicine was clouding his judgment. Perhaps he simply couldn't face another retreat, another failure, another pile of Roman bodies left to rot in foreign soil. Perhaps he was waiting for a sign. What he got was a storm. It came from nowhere. Clear skies giving way to thunderheads so fast that some soldiers later claimed divine intervention. The wind struck first, a blast of cool air that felt like mercy. Then the rain. Not ordinary rain. A deluge. Water falling in sheets so thick you could barely see 10 feet. It flooded the valley floor, filled helmets and shields and every container the Romans could find. Men stood with their faces upturned, mouths open, weeping with relief as the water hit their tongues. But the miracle was just beginning. The same storm that saved the Romans struck the Quadi positions with different fury. Lightning, bolt after bolt, striking the hilltops where the Germanic warriors had gathered to watch the Romans die. Fire erupted among their ranks. The wind, channeled by the valley walls, hit the hilltops with devastating force. The Quadi panicked. Some fled. Others charged downhill, driven by terror into a Roman army that moments before had been helpless. Marcus's legions met them with a ferocity that weeks of suffering had built up, rage and relief, and the desperate energy of men who had expected to die and suddenly weren't. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted perhaps an hour. The Quadi broke completely, scattering into the forests, abandoning their siege, leaving behind hundreds of dead. Roman sources called it divine intervention. The rain miracle became one of Marcus's most celebrated moments, proof that the gods favoured Rome, that the emperor's virtue had summoned heaven itself to rescue his soldiers. A famous column erected in Rome depicted the scene, Jupiter's rain god pouring water on grateful legionaries, while lightning destroyed their enemies. Historians still debate whether the storm was divine, coincidental, or simply the luck that sometimes favours the desperate. Some modern scholars have proposed natural explanations, a weather phenomenon, an unexpected front, the unpredictable meteorology of the Germanic summer. Marcus himself never claimed the miracle publicly. His meditations mention the event only obliquely, referring to forces beyond our understanding with characteristic Stoic ambiguity. But privately, the miracle changed him. Not toward faith. Marcus remained skeptical of the gods, viewing them as useful social constructs rather than real beings. No, the miracle changed him toward ruthlessness. If the gods, or fate, or chance had saved his army, then surely his cause was just. Surely the massacres had been necessary. Surely the brutality was part of some larger plan that required him to be brutal. The universe had validated his methods. Why question them now? The campaigns that followed the rain miracle were the most devastating of the war. Marcus pushed north with a savagery that shocked even his own commanders. Villages weren't just burned, they were erased, their populations killed or enslaved, their very existence purged from the landscape. Prisoners were executed in batches, their deaths serving as warnings to tribes that hadn't yet submitted. "Nature has given you resources," Marcus wrote. "It is for you to use them." He was no longer using philosophy to guide his conscience. He was using it to silence his conscience. The same frameworks that had once taught restraint now justified atrocity. The philosopher had found a way to make philosophy serve the butcher. And the butcher was just getting started, and the battle is over. The real tragedy is just beginning. By 175 AD, the northern frontier was quiet, not peaceful. Peace would require healing that wouldn't come for generations, but quiet. The Marcomanni had surrendered. The Quadi had submitted. The Usigs had signed treaties that pushed them back across the Danube and bound them to provide cavalry auxiliaries for Rome. Marcus had won. He stood on a ridge overlooking the river, watching Germanic hostages being led south in chains. Thousands of them. Chieftains' sons, promising warriors, anyone whose captivity might guarantee their tribe's compliance. They would spend years in Roman territory, learning Latin, absorbing Roman culture, becoming too Roman to lead effectively when they finally returned home. It was standard imperial practice. It was also Marcus's idea. He'd refined the hostage system personally, applying philosophical principles to the problem of long-term pacification. Remove the next generation of leaders. Replace tribal identity with imperial loyalty. Make the barbarians into Romans before they knew what they'd lost. The stratagem would work for decades. Some of those hostages would become Roman citizens, even senators, but others would remember what had been done to their people. Their children would remember, and when Rome eventually weakened, Those memories would fuel a vengeance that would bring the empire to its knees. Marcus didn't see that future. He saw only the present, the quiet frontier, the subdued tribes, the reports from his generals confirming that the immediate crisis had passed. He'd saved the empire. He'd done the impossible. Why did it feel like losing? The answer arrived in fragments scattered across the following months. A conversation with Galen that revealed just how much Theriac he was now consuming. A letter from Faustina that mentioned, too casually, how little their son Commodus seemed interested in governance. A visit to a field hospital where soldiers who'd survived the battles were dying slowly from wounds that wouldn't heal. "You look tired, Caesar," one of them told him. A centurion, both legs amputated at the knee, infection spreading despite Galen's efforts. "You should rest." Marcus almost laughed. Rest? When had he last rested? The medicine kept him awake, kept him working, kept him feeling almost alive. But underneath the pharmaceutical scaffolding, something had crumbled. The Marcus who'd read philosophy for pleasure was gone. The Marcus who'd loved his wife with genuine tenderness saw her now through a haze of suspicion and exhaustion. The Marcus who'd wanted to be a good man no longer remembered what that meant. He tried to remember. He returned to his meditations, reading entries he'd written years earlier, searching for the person he'd been before the wars. The words were familiar. He could recite them from memory, but they felt like letters from a stranger. Begin the morning by saying to yourself, "I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial." He'd written that as a young man before he understood what those words really meant. Before he'd ordered busybodies killed and had the ungrateful crucified. Before arrogance had become strategy and deceit had become statecraft. Historians still debate whether Marcus experienced what modern observers might call moral injury, the psychological damage that comes from violating one's own ethical principles. The term didn't exist in ancient Rome, but the symptoms were clear. Numbness, alienation, the sense that something essential had been destroyed. He dealt with it the only way he knew how. More Theriac, more work, more campaigns. The empire required constant maintenance. The Marcomanni had been subdued, but the Sarmatians were restless. Egypt's grain supply was threatened by local unrest. The governor of Syria was acting suspiciously independent. The currency was collapsing. Marcus had debased it repeatedly to fund the wars, and now merchants were demanding 3 silver pieces for what had cost 1 a decade earlier. Problems. Always more problems. "Accept the things to which fate binds you," he wrote, late one night, when the medicine was wearing off and the pain was returning. "And love the people with whom fate brings you together." Love. He'd loved Faustina once. Now he avoided her chambers, slept alone when he slept at all. He'd loved his tutors, his philosophy, his dreams of a contemplative life. Now he couldn't read 3 sentences without his attention fracturing. He'd loved his principles most of all. The belief that a man could be good without being weak, that power and virtue could coexist, that the throne didn't have to corrupt the soul that sat upon it. Those principles were dead now, killed in 1,000 small moments, an order given, a plea ignored, a massacre approved. Killed by necessities that had stopped being necessary somewhere along the way but hadn't stopped happening. He had won the war, he had lost himself, and the worst part was just arriving in Rome. A 17-year-old boy who looked nothing like Marcus, who thought nothing like Marcus, who would inherit everything Marcus had built and burn it to the ground. His son, his heir, his final failure. The boy killed his first man at 15, not in battle. Commodus had never seen battle, would never choose to see battle if he could help it. No, he killed a slave in the imperial household, apparently for the crime of serving wine at the wrong temperature. The death was covered up, of course. Servants talked, but servants could be silenced. The slave's family received a payment, blood money that bought their silence and their complicity. The incident was forgotten, filed away among the countless small brutalities that characterized Roman aristocratic life. But Marcus knew. He'd seen the body before it was removed. He'd looked into his son's eyes and found something there that philosophers had no name for. Not cruelty. Cruelty implied passion. Not madness. Madness implied loss of control. Something colder. Something that looked at human beings the way Marcus looked at insects. He told himself it was an isolated incident. A boy's temper, correctable. He assigned Commodus new tutors, the best Stoic teachers he could find, the same tradition that had shaped Marcus himself. He lectured his son on virtue, duty, the responsibilities of power. He demonstrated by example the kind of restraint and self-discipline an emperor required. Commodus listened politely, nodded at the right moments, promised to do better. Then he went out and killed another slave. The pattern repeated over the following years. Violence, cover-up, lecture, violence. Marcus increased the tutoring. Commodus increased the killing. By 18, he'd worked through half a dozen household servants and discovered a new interest: gladiatorial combat. Not as a spectator. Commodus fought personally. In private at first, in specially constructed arenas within the palace grounds, against professionals who understood that losing too convincingly might cost them more than the match. He dressed as a gladiator, named himself after Hercules, collected weapons that had actually drawn blood in the arena. It was unprecedented. It was humiliating. It was everything Marcus had spent his life arguing against, and there was nothing he could do about it. Remove Commodus from the succession. The mechanisms didn't really exist. Roman emperors were supposed to choose their successors, but the choice was validated by the army and the Senate, and Commodus was legally, indisputably Marcus's son. Declaring him unfit would trigger a succession crisis that might destroy the empire Marcus had spent decades protecting. Kill him? The thought must have crossed Marcus's mind. He'd killed thousands of people, women, children, warriors who posed far less threat than the monster sharing his palace. One more death, properly arranged, and the empire would pass to... who? Marcus had no other sons. His brothers were dead. The logical alternatives were ambitious generals who might prove just as dangerous as Commodus. Historians still debate whether Marcus seriously considered eliminating his son. The sources are contradictory. Some suggest he ordered an investigation into Commodus's suitability, only to suppress the findings when they confirmed what he already knew. Others claim he made provisions for alternative succession that were somehow blocked or lost. The truth is probably simpler and sadder. Marcus loved his son, not the monster Commodus was becoming. No one could love that. But the child Commodus had been, or that Marcus remembered him being, the boy who'd sat on his father's knee during campaigns, who'd asked questions about philosophy that suggested genuine curiosity, who'd shown flashes of compassion before something, the court's corruption, bad companions, some fundamental flaw in his nature, extinguished them. That boy was gone. But parents don't stop hoping. They don't stop seeing the children their offspring might have been, even when the evidence of what they are becomes undeniable. Marcus was the most powerful man in the world, but he was also a father, with a father's blindness. He doubled down on education. He brought Commodus on campaign, hoping that exposure to real warfare might somehow instill the discipline that court life hadn't. He assigned his best commanders as mentors, with instructions to model virtue and strength. Commodus learned to fight. He learned to give orders. He learned the surface mannerisms of leadership, the confident stance, the decisive tone, the appearance of authority. He didn't learn anything that mattered. "I have done what I could," Marcus wrote in his final years. "The rest is fate." It was a Stoic sentiment, philosophically correct, but it was also a confession of failure. The man who'd spent his life arguing that individuals could shape their own characters, that virtue was achievable through discipline and effort, was admitting that some people couldn't be saved. His own son, his legacy, the future emperor of Rome. Marcus watched Commodus practice with swords in the imperial courtyard, moving with a grace that Marcus himself had never possessed. The boy was talented, physically gifted. In another life, he might have been a great general, a champion athlete, something that channeled his appetites productively. Instead, he would be emperor. And Rome would learn what Marcus had already discovered, that the throne amplifies whatever occupies it. Virtue becomes great virtue. Vice becomes catastrophe. The catastrophe was already taking shape. Marcus just couldn't admit it. The pain was constant now. Not the sharp pain of battle wounds or broken bones. That at least would have been honest. This was something subtler. An ache that spread through his chest, his joints, his stomach. A weakness that no amount of rest could remedy. A decline that accelerated each month, as if his body had finally decided to collect the debts his mind had been accumulating for decades. Marcus was dying. He'd known it for years. The coughing fits that produced blood. The nights when breathing felt like drowning. The way his vision blurred during meetings, forcing him to rely on secretaries to read documents he could no longer focus on. Galen had given up pretending the Theriac was medicine. Now it was simply management, keeping the Emperor functional long enough to complete whatever essential business remained. The doses had become enormous. Marcus took them mechanically, the way he performed every other duty, without pleasure, without complaint, without feeling much of anything. The winter of 180 AD found him on the frontier again. The Marcomanni had started raiding, testing Roman resolve, probing for weakness. Marcus didn't have the strength to lead campaigns anymore, but he could still project authority. His presence at the Danube kept the generals focused and the tribes cautious. It also kept him away from Rome, away from Commodus, away from watching his son transform the court into something that made Marcus's worst fears seem optimistic. The reports came anyway. Commodus was spending imperial funds on gladiatorial equipment. Commodus had taken a wrestler as his closest advisor. Commodus had ordered executions, not many yet, but enough to establish a pattern. The boy was testing limits, discovering how much he could get away with. Marcus read the reports, filed them, did nothing. What was left to do? He spent his final months writing. The Meditations had been his companion for decades, a private journal never meant for publication, where he talked to himself about philosophy, duty, the struggles of trying to be good in an impossible job. Now the writing became compulsive, desperate, as if getting the words down might somehow preserve the person he'd been before everything went wrong. "Death smiles at us all," he wrote. "All a man can do is smile back." But he wasn't smiling, he was cataloguing, making lists of virtues he'd failed to embody, commandments he'd violated, principles he'd betrayed in the name of necessity. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one. He'd written that as a younger man, confident that being good was primarily a matter of decision and effort. Now he understood the bitter joke. You could decide to be good. You could make tremendous effort, and the world would still grind you down, compromise by compromise, until the person who emerged bore no resemblance to the one who started. The Stoics taught that the wise man maintains inner peace regardless of external circumstances. Marcus had spent his life trying to achieve that peace. He'd studied the teachings, practiced the disciplines, applied the frameworks to every decision. And he'd discovered that the Stoics were wrong. Not completely wrong, the techniques helped. But the core promise was false. You couldn't separate inner from outer, soul from circumstance. What you did changed who you were. The massacres had changed him. The addiction had changed him. The failures with Commodus had changed him. The person meditating in this frozen tent was not the person who'd wanted to be a philosopher 50 years ago. Historians still debate whether Marcus's meditations represent genuine philosophical insight or the rationalizations of a guilty conscience. The answer is probably both. The writings are brilliant. Even 2,000 years later, they offer wisdom that resonates. They're also desperate, repetitive, circling the same themes of acceptance and duty, as if saying them often enough might make them true. Accept the things to which fate binds you. He'd accepted plague, he'd accepted war, he'd accepted addiction and failure and the slow destruction of everything he valued. But accepting Commodus, accepting that his life's work would be undone by his own son, that was beyond him. The end came in March of 180 AD. The accounts vary. Some say Marcus caught a cold that developed into pneumonia. Others suggest the illness that had been killing him for years simply finished the job. A few dark rumours, never substantiated, hint at poison, either self-administered or provided by those eager to see Commodus take power. Galen attended him at the end. The physician who'd kept him functioning for 2 decades watched the final decline with professional detachment. There was nothing more to be done. The Theriac had stopped working. The body was shutting down. All that remained was the transition. Marcus's last recorded words were addressed to the guards outside his tent. "Go to the rising sun, my sun is setting." Then he turned his face to the wall and stopped speaking. The philosopher-emperor died as he had lived for the past 15 years, alone, in pain, surrounded by an empire he could no longer control. The empire endured. Commodus received the news with visible impatience. He was 19 years old. He'd been waiting his entire adult life for this moment, the moment when the lectures stopped, the tutors disappeared, and the power became truly his. No more pretending to study philosophy. No more nodding at strategic briefings. No more performing the role of dutiful son while his father watched with those tired, disappointed eyes. The old man was dead. The throne was his. The transformation began immediately. Within weeks of taking sole power, Commodus abandoned the frontier. The wars his father had fought for 15 years. Pointless. The territories gained through blood and sacrifice. Expendable. He signed treaties that returned everything Marcus had conquered, withdrew the legions and headed for Rome. He wanted to fight in the arena. He wanted to dress as Hercules. He wanted to rename Rome after himself, Colonia Commodiana, and be worshipped as a living god. The serious business of governing an empire bored him beyond endurance. The Senate watched in horror as Marcus's legacy dismantled itself. The generals who'd served under the philosopher-emperor found themselves replaced by gladiators and wrestlers. The administrators who'd kept the machinery running were dismissed in favour of sycophants who told Commodus what he wanted to hear. And the killing began in earnest. Not slaves this time. Commodus had graduated beyond that. Senators, generals, anyone who'd been loyal to Marcus became suspect. Anyone who showed competence became a threat. The executions accelerated over 12 years, hollowing out Rome's governing class, replacing experience with terror. The empire Marcus had spent his life preserving began its long collapse. Not immediately. Rome was too vast, too resilient to fall quickly. But the Marcomannic Wars had cracked foundations that would never be repaired. The plague had killed the manpower that would have been needed for recovery. The currency debasement Marcus had used to fund his campaigns destroyed the economic stability that might have funded reform, and Commodus, beautiful, athletic, utterly insane Commodus, drove the decay forward with enthusiasm. Historians still debate whether Marcus could have prevented any of this, if he'd removed Commodus from the succession, if he'd named a more capable heir, if he'd been a better father, or a less distracted one, or simply luckier in the genetic lottery. The debates missed the point. Marcus Aurelius was trapped by the same systems he'd spent his life defending. The Roman Empire didn't accommodate philosopher-kings, it consumed them. The machinery of power required constant feeding, military victories, economic expansion, political loyalty purchased through patronage and fear. A man could be virtuous or he could be effective, but trying to be both would break him. Marcus had tried. For nearly 20 years as emperor, he genuinely attempted to rule justly while defending Rome against threats that would have destroyed weaker leaders. He'd failed, of course. The massacres proved that. The addiction proved that. Commodus proved that. But the failure wasn't for lack of effort. The failure was structural, built into an empire that had conquered too much, expanded too fast, depended on systems that required cruelty to function. Rome lasted another 3 centuries after Marcus. Sometimes it prospered, more often it lurched from crisis to crisis. But something essential died with the philosopher-emperor. The idea that Rome could be more than a machine for conquest and extraction, the belief that power and wisdom could coexist. Commodus was assassinated in 192 AD, strangled by a wrestler in his own bath, a fitting end for an emperor who'd spent his reign in the arena. The succession crisis that followed killed tens of thousands and nearly shattered the empire entirely. By the time Septimius Severus emerged victorious, Rome had entered a new era, harsher, more militarized, with no pretense of philosophical governance. The meditations survived. Somehow, despite never being intended for publication, Marcus's private journal made its way into circulation. Copies spread through the empire and beyond. Philosophers studied them. Emperors claimed to be inspired by them. The words Marcus had written in frozen tents and plague-ravaged cities became a cornerstone of Western thought. But the words had separated from the man who wrote them. The Marcus Aurelius that history remembers is a marble statue, serene, wise, untouched by the chaos of his reign. The real Marcus Aurelius died on the Danube frontier, addicted to opium, having ordered atrocities that would haunt him to his final breath, leaving behind a son who would destroy everything he'd built. The real Marcus Aurelius was a warning, not an inspiration. A warning about what power does to people who try to resist it. A warning about systems that corrupt even those who understand corruption. A warning about the gap between who we want to be and who we become when the pressure never stops. You have power over your mind, not outside events, he wrote. Realize this, and you will find strength. He was wrong. The outside events broke him. The plague, the wars, the addiction, the sun. Each one took something, and what was left at the end bore no resemblance to the philosopher who'd wanted nothing more than a quiet life of study. They built statues. They preserved his words. They made him a symbol of everything he'd failed to be. The empire endured. The man did not. History remembers the statue, and it forgot the corpse beneath it.